gas laws are calculated with Kelvin. And I will also promise you, when you take an exam on a gas law, and it's a multiple choice exam, there will be an answer that is the correct answer. There will also be an answer that you forgot to convert to Kelvin, and it'll be right there. And you go, there's the answer. I just calculated it. It'll be there. So just because you see, you do a calculator, and you get 31.5 degrees Celsius or whatever it is, 35 psi, whatever, that doesn't mean you actually did find the right answer. Make sure you convert to Kelvin. Okay? Energy is measured in unit, your SI unit. Metric unit is Celsius or degrees Celsius. The standard unit is Fahrenheit. Yes, it's so crazy. And I don't know if all the clinical sites are this way. I need to find out about that. But you know, like at UF Health, the measurements Fahrenheit and pre-op. We use Celsius in the OR, and then Fahrenheit again in PACU. Okay. And I don't know how many times I'll say to the nurse in PACU, no, 96.3 degrees doesn't make any sense because they were 37.2 in the OR. And I can see this like blank stare. What is 37.2 supposed to mean to me? You know, and you get used to it. I mean, it's the same way for me. I get so used to Celsius that, like, if I were to measure in Fahrenheit during a case, I'd have to think about it a little bit. Okay, is 96.6 a problem? How bad is that? But I know exactly how bad 34.2 is. Okay? So, because I'm used to that. That's what I'm looking at every day. I mean, I was fighting at 5 o'clock this morning for my patient to get above 34.2. Yeah.
You meant to say temperature is measured in units, right? Which are defined by the International System of Units, Kelvin, right?
Kelvin is the SI unit.
For temperature?
Metric for temperature, yeah.
Not an energy, right?
Energy, temperature is the measure of energy. Yeah, so in the case of temperature, temperature is energy. So, yeah, so, all right. And then 1 calorie is the amount of heat necessary to raise the temperature of 1 gram or 1 cubic centimeter of water by 1 degree Celsius. The joule is the metric calorie unit. Thermometers. So, okay, so we're talking about a liquid. The more heat that's there, the more there's energy, the more kinetic energy, and there's more movement and expansion. And that's how thermometers work. So as there's more heat added to mercury, for example, it expands and then you see it rise. Although, yes, we don't have mercury thermometers anymore because I don't know any like 4 people. I remember the kid having mercury thermometers. And mommy saying, "Don't bite down on that."
So how do modern
Same way, they just use different. Oh, yeah, we're talking about like the ones that you see, the red, you know. But as far as all the other ones, I mean, some use piezoelectric crystals. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways they work now that we're not going to get into, nor could I really tell you. You know, as far as the mechanics of how they work. But anything that you see a rising, you see it rise, like those old school ones that are red still. And those are even now old school ones as well. It was major development to go from mercury to whatever that red stuff is when I was younger. Anyways.
So, I was just questioning because Dr. Welder's text makes it seem like water and mercury were the only 2 substances that we.
Well, but those are the only ones. So maybe that red stuff is water. I don't know. I don't know what that red stuff is on those. You know, the farmer thermometers you see. You know, the nice cheap ones out. Yeah, everything else, nobody uses those kinds anymore. You know, but maybe that is water. But water can only expand so far. So I was some kind of. Anyways, not that important. Just know that the liquid ones, that's how they work by expansion. But when you're doing like a temporal artery one, there's no expansion involved. It's all sensors and that kind of thing. So, all right, majority of the body's heat is in the core, the brain, the thorax, the abdomen, not the hands, not the arms, not the legs. That's the core, and that's where a majority of our heat is. And so we have different places where we measure temperature, and they they can be defined as core temperatures or peripheral temperatures. So if you measure at any of these sites, anywhere in the abdomen, anywhere in the thorax, anywhere in the brain, you are measuring a core site. So an esophageal probe, core. A bladder temperature probe, core. How about a PA catheter? Absolutely core, right? A skin temperature probe, anywhere. Peripheral. One of the most arguable ones is a tympanic, because it's like, it's part of the brain and you're trying to shoot the brain, but it's very inaccurate. Technically core, but really it's not one of the better places to measure. You really want to focus on core body temperature measurement, not peripheral. The common core measuring sites are the ones I have right here. So it is technically core, it's just not one of the better ones to do. The rectum is also a core temperature. Your metabolic rate increases by 67% for each degree Celsius increase in core temperature. Cardiac output increases by 3 liters per minute per degree Celsius. Now, one of the things you have to think about with this is chicken and egg. Okay, so is the metabolic rate increasing because the temperature increases, or is the temperature increasing because the metabolic rate is increasing? Because we'll talk about a little bit later, where does it come from? We'll get to that later. All right, so these are some memorize it stuff that is important, but just definitely memorize it. Absolute humidity is the mass, and that's the key thing to think about, the mass of water vapor in a given volume of air. Okay? So absolute humidity will be measured in like milligrams per liter, or milliliter, or whatever. Relative humidity is a ratio, like a percent, of the mass of water vapor in a given volume of air to the mass required to saturate that given volume of air at the same temperature. Okay, so we all can accept that the warmer the air, the more water it can hold in an evaporated state. We all know that, right? And that's back in the 5th grade, maybe the 2nd grade. You learn about condensation and evaporation. Okay. We all accept that. All right, so that means that temperature of this room right now can hold less water than the temperature of the air in your alveoli. Because the so the air in your alveoli can hold more water than the air that we're breathing right now. Okay? So, when you have an endotracheal tube in your mouth, or your patient does, and they breathe in ambient air that has some percentage of water in it, okay? There's some relative humidity to that air, and it reaches the alveoli. One thing that we know as fact is the relative humidity of the air in the alveoli is 100%. Okay, which means that the mass of water in the air of the alveoli is the same as the maximum mass possible. That's our definition. It's the ratio of the mass of water vapor in a given volume of air to the mass required to saturate that air. So in the case of the alveoli, it's 44 milligrams per liter, assuming 37 degrees Celsius. Okay? So if you were to take that air and sample it in your alveoli and measure the amount of water there, it would be 44 milligrams per liter. Okay? Now, we breathe that air out. It starts coming out the endotracheal tube. What happens to the temperature of that air? It drops immediately. So now we have 44 milligrams per liter of water in the air, but suddenly when that temperature drops, it cannot hold 44 milligrams per liter of air, of water, right? So this part right here, the mass required to saturate that given volume of air at the same temperature drops. Now let's say it can only hold 40 or 35 or whatever it is. They can hold less water, but you have more water than that. what happens? Condensation. And that's what you see in the endotracheal tube. When you ventilate the patient, you squeeze, it goes away. Why? Because we're putting non-saturated ambient air in there. We let go, it breathes out, and that saturated becomes supersaturated condensation. You know, in weather, when they say it's 50% humidity out there, that's a relative humidity term, because you know by saying percentage. That means that whatever mass of water is in that volume of air, you could double it before you reach 100%. So you need to know absolute humidity. You need to know relative humidity. If I asked you a person, you know, I say there's 40% humidity, which expression is that? That's relative humidity. Percent, that's key. When you hear milligrams, that's absolute humidity. Humidity is measured by a hygrometer. No, we don't have hygrometers in our anesthesia machines. We don't have to deal with that. These are different ways that you can humidify our vapors, the gases our patients breathe. Okay? So this is describing what I said. One more thing to memorize. The vapor pressure at 37 degrees Celsius, when you are 100% relative humidity, is 47 millimeters of mercury. Now you're about to get a lecture in 2 weeks now, well, it's going to be one, on pressure, force, gravity, and pressure. And you'll learn all the different measures of pressure, millimeters of mercury, core, PSI, centimeters of water. You'll need to be able to convert from one to the other. And all you have to do is know what those ratios are. That 760 millimeters of mercury is the same as 1 atmosphere, same as
14.7 psi.
110, oh gosh, 1020, oh gosh, 1,000 millibars. You know, is that, no, not 1,000, yeah, like 1,000, oh, I need.
It's 1 mil, 1 bar.
1 bar, 1,000 millibars, yeah, okay. So, as long as you know those ratios, you can do the calculations, okay? And I'll do that to you on the gas laws. I'll express something in 1 unit of percent of pressure, and I'll ask you the answer and the difference. Yeah. You can do the gas law and then just convert it at the end. Anyways, in the gas laws, if you start with PSI, you can stick with PSI. You don't have to convert it to something else. The only one you have to convert to use the gas law is temperature. You must use Kelvin. Okay, so, all right. All right, we'll talk a little bit about thermoregulation anymore. Okay, thermoregulation. We have afferent input, central control, and efferent responses. So the hypothalamus it contains structures throughout that modulate the thermoregulation and sets the body's temperature set point. The periaqueductal gray matter in the hypothalamus transmits efferent signals to the effector sites, things like the rector pili muscles, vascular smooth muscle, all sorts of places, to then either participate in warmth-seeking behaviors or warmth-releasing behaviors. So like in the case of hyperthermia, you'll have warmth-relieving behaviors like vasodilation, no piloerection, no shivering, stuff like that. How about, what would be another warmth relieving thing? Very common. Sweating, yes. All right. But if you were hypothermic, these are some of the things that would occur. All right. So this shows that whole process. I can see it better up here. So if your body's set point is a certain temperature, in this case, let's say 37 degrees Celsius, if that temperature rises above normal, you'll then start getting these efferent responses that we just talked about. And then when it gets too low, then the afferent response will then cause you to stop doing what you're doing, or the opposite. It's the same way the other way. I mean, if you're too cold, then you'll have the opposite occur. For any of us, assuming our brain's working normally and we're not on any drugs, that set point threshold is very small. I mean, even like a 0.2 degrees Celsius variance can cause you to engage in your body to naturally engage in these hemostatic behaviors. Under anesthesia, that is absolutely not the case. All right, so afferent input, cold receptors, and warm receptors. So not only do you have receptors that tell the brain you're warm, you have receptors that tell the brain you're cold. Those receptors respond differently under anesthesia. Like for example, the ones that tell you you're cold are much more blunted than the ones that tell you you're warm under anesthesia. And when I mentioned earlier that this latest article I was reading, it was like instead of, and it's just escaping me right now, the actual subtype receptor, but then it was even more specific than that. Oh, geez, there's always another level. But anyways, those are coming in via A delta and C fibers. Oh, you're going to learn about this more this summer. Via the lateral spinal thalamic tract, and sends it up to the thalamus and says, hey, I'm cold, or hey, I'm hot. All right. That central control, the hypothalamus integrates that afferent input and a response. And there's that interthreshold range, generally about 0.2, that's not a negative, that's a little bullet, 0.2 degrees Celsius. So if you get out of that, we all have a little bit slightly different set point, but if you range out of that at all, your body responds. And it can be pretty profound response. And that's at the locus subcoeruleus. So efferent response is diaphoresis, vasodilation, vasoconstriction, shivering. Shivering thermogenesis is regulated by the shivering motor center adjacent to the posterior hypothalamus. It basically sends a signal causing us to shiver. Shivering can increase metabolic rate significantly. At one point, it was taught in anesthesia school as much as 500%. The literature I've read says that's a little bit of an exaggeration. But this is an important piece of information. If your patient, let's say you have a patient who is got severe CAD and they're having angina post-op, you take them to PACU, and they're even saying they have some chest pain, and they're shivering. That shivering is not helpful at all, because you're really increasing the metabolic demand of that body. So, yeah, I've had lots of patients shiver that I'm like, yeah, give me some Demerol, but I mostly do that just to blunt the shivering, and because the patient doesn't like shivering. But otherwise, I don't really care that much. But in certain situations, you do care more than others, you know. So, anyhow, non-shivering thermogenesis is a complex mechanism not involving ATP. The thing we think about the most with that is brown fat metabolism, which is something that happens with neonates. So neonates, they also teach generally they can't shiver. Actually, Sessler would tell you that's not true, but it's not very significant. So they don't have that ability to shiver to help create heat, and so but they can metabolize brown fat to help create heat. We have lots of fat, some of us, but not brown fat. So as far as adults go, so bottom line is the anterior hypothalamus helps involve the hypothermia, like pigs, and so you can see kind of where MH was induced, and it's interesting to see not all the sites that you would think would be affected. Like rectal is really surprising. Rectal is, although it's considered a core temperature site, there's a delay in its change generally. But you can see the one that was the most sensitive, the two that were the most sensitive were esophageal and axillary. And you know, esophageal is a great site, but it'll just show the temperature change more quickly. Also, I want to point out that if you were doing like a skin temperature probe and somebody had MH, it would take some time before you would notice the temperature. Yeah.
Well, with like bladder temp, would that be somewhere along the same lines, like possibly rectal? Or?
I don't think they studied bladder, so I can't tell you for sure. But I would think it would be somewhere in between, but I don't know for sure. Yeah.
This is on the same patient?
Let's see. Actually, the temperature is recorded well during.
Oh, it's swine.
It's swine, yeah. But like, I guess I didn't do it to the same swine over and over again. There's clearly more than one. Poor, you know, I mean, so, but I don't know how many.
I mean, maybe I was thinking they did all the same measurements simultaneously.
They just measured the different pigs, they gave them MH and measured the change in temperatures. Probably they had all the sites at the same time and watched which one changed. You can see that they even started at different points. That's another interesting thing. Notice the peripheral sites are much lower. Much lower. Axillary was also lower. These are the core sites. They started out with a temperature closer to 38 degrees. But if you were doing a skin temperature measurement, you wouldn't think that at all. All right. Another thing that's very important to note, and we're going to do a little bit later too, is that there is also a difference between the heat state of the core and the periphery. We constantly live in some kind of balance between what our core temperature is and our periphery. With our periphery generally being lower than our core, it's not so much that the skin temperature in Chrome is wrong, it's just that is the temperature of the skin. You know, the skin generally is less than the core. When we induce our patients in anesthesia, what do we do to their ability to fight hypothermia? We blunt it big time. One, we impair the brain's ability to recognize the presence of hypothermia. That's one. And then two, we impair the brain's ability to control efferent sites by, like when they say, okay, then vasoconstrict. No, we're vasodilating you. Sorry, too bad. Sorry, not sorry, whatever, you know. So now what happens? We lose our heat peripherally, and then the core then starts transmitting that heat back to the periphery. We call that redistribution of heat. So it's not like we just lose it peripherally and then we're good. No, we lose. What did I say that was so funny?
Sorry.
Is that like one of y'all's little funny things, or?
It's a song.
How do I know it's a song? Oh, I don't tweet. I do that with my kids all the time. I use like words not quite right just to let them like roll their eyes at me. You know? I'll be like, I didn't bend that. Really, Dad? You wouldn't even say bind that, Dad. Really?
Yeah. Don't worry, Dr. I'm with you with that one.
That's okay. I'll say this out loud because we're recording recently. That song was on. That's Beyonce, right? Sorry, not sorry. Who was it? Demi Lovato. That's right. And I didn't know that, but I forgot. This sounds like Beyonce.
Oh,
she just said sorry. But anyway, but recently that song was on, and my wife said something like, "Yeah, this is like a song I think about a lot."
Whoa.
Really? She goes, no, not really. Yeah, really. So now when she says sorry, I say, not sorry? So anyway, it's too late on Friday to have those asides. Sorry. Okay. Not sorry. All right. So except in Florida, why do we say warm? Well, we have insulation. Some people more than others. But beyond that, metabolism determines heat production. The environment influences heat loss. Okay? So it's all about that balance of heat production versus how much do we lose. So why does hypothermia happen to our patients? Well, one, we make them naked. And that's my youngest when he was very young. So, like a month old. He was so little. Look at that. Look at that. I mean, you could grab it, like, you could almost pick him up by it, you know? You see the Animal Planet stuff. Anyways, you know, he was so little. But, and he was very not fussy, except when we were trying to get these pictures. So anyways, so yeah, we do this to our patients all the time. Sometimes we can't help it. And one of the type of patient that is at the highest risk for hypothermia are trauma patients. I mean, my patient last night came in 33.9 degrees. It was acidotic. I think he had been sitting outside for hours before he finally came in. He was getting hypothermic, acidotic. He hadn't bled that much. He just, it was probably 50 degrees outside last night, and 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 for 3 hours, I got him up to 34.6 because they had to prep almost the entire body. So we had an underbody bear hugger and one like over the head,
Don't you turn the rooms up to 95?
Oh, but we had it as high as it goes, but it doesn't go as hot as it should.
We used to call environmental services,
Yeah.
and they would turn it up to 95.
Yeah, so anyway, but then also why hypothermia happens in some places other than Florida, it's just dang cold. So, what's wrong with hypothermia? Well, lots of things. It affects, this is causal hypothermia. What's wrong with hypothermia? Causal hypothermia, they're all here. Exposure, vasodilation, skin disorders, like burns, for example. There's things that we do to the patient. We give them cold fluids, and that kind of thing. We open up their abdomen, and let all that bowel get exposed to the ambient air. And then there's decreased heat production that can cause it. Impaired, new prescription. Impaired regulation, and then other things. There's all sorts of causes, yes?
If we're concerned about getting fluids for patients, why would we give them hypothermia?
Well, when we are concerned, we do. We should. So, well, we're not always as concerned as other times. Okay, so let's say you're doing a laparoscopic bilateral tubal ligation. Case takes 20 minutes. Low risk procedure. The problems that we'll end up describing about what's wrong with hypothermia aren't that likely for that patient. They're healthy or whatever. Then, if they get a little hypothermic, it's not that big a deal. Take another patient who, take my patient last night, who is at high risk for coagulopathy, and hypothermia is a big risk factor for coagulopathy. I'm really worried, and then there's wound healing, all sorts of things that I'm worried about. So not every patient are you as worried about hypothermia as others. The thing is, in general, anesthesia providers are not worried enough anyways. So you'll find a lot of people not doing things to help protect them. As far as warming fluids, another thing I will talk about is, well, how much fluids are you giving them? If you're just going to give them a liter for a 2-hour case, you're giving it slowly. It's not that much fluid that you're giving them, and if you warmed it, it'd be cold by the time you get to them anyways. So, yeah. So, heat loss. Okay, this is very important. How do we lose heat? There's 4 ways we do it. You're going to have to learn them. These are key elements of this lecture. Radiation is the transfer of heat energy by emission of infrared radiation, like electromagnetic waves. I'm radiating you. Actually, I'm radiating my shirt, but my hand's radiating you. Yeah. So anyway, my hand's radiating you, my head is radiating you, and the ceiling and the walls. It's just going out in all sorts of different directions. And literally, when it hits that table, that photon radiation, that electromagnetic wave hits there and actually warms the table. Yeah. So that's radiation. Convection is a transfer of thermal energy by heating, touching something. So, when you say, hey, thanks for warming the seat up for me, honey, we're talking about convection, that's conduction. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. That's conduction, so I'm going to jump ahead. Conduction is that touching to touching. So you literally are transferring heat from a higher thermal state to a lower thermal state and warming it up. So the conduction is that. Convection is transferring that heat to the air around you and then moving it away. So it transfers thermal energy by heating air adjacent to the skin, and then as it can either do it itself, it gets more heat, so it has more kinetic energy, and then as it expands, it moves away, or we do it by other ways, like laminar currents in the operating room or whatever. So the way I kind of think of convection is, I like to give the pool example. No, not that way of warming pools. So you're sitting there and the pool is cold. And everybody else is getting in, so I guess I'll get in too. Or your kids demand that you get in because, you're a good dad or whatever. So you get in that pool and you're like, it's so cold, it's so cold. And then, like, 2 minutes later, you forgot that you're cold. You're like, you even forgot. And then all of a sudden, hey, Daddy, come over here. And you go, oh, it's cold. Oh, it's cold. What happened? You warmed the water right around you and then convected it away by moving. Or somebody jumps in the pool and water moves around and all of a sudden that cold little current comes and hits you. So it's the same thing with air around you. You literally warm that air around you, and then when a wind comes by or just that natural process of that kinetic energy moving, cold air replaces it. That's convection. So, and we'll get to why all that's relevant soon. And then evaporation is the last one. So, so basically, when water evaporates, it's an endothermic reaction. It actually absorbs energy to do so, and that therefore there's a loss of heat. So when you have evaporation on your skin, you think it's cold. It's cold because it actually takes heat away from that area. That's why it feels that way. So this kind of shows each one. Here's radiation, evaporation, so we lose heat by evaporation from our air moisture, open abdomens, like open skin incisions, that kind of thing, evaporation, convection, and then conduction. So we generally our patients just conduct the over typically. Which ones are bigger deals than others? Radiation is the biggest deal. Believe it or not, it is the biggest source of heat loss. So when you have the take-home message is cover your patients, because if you have them naked, they're losing heat 3 ways. That if they're not naked, it's not so bad. Okay? When they're naked, they're irradiating the ceiling. That doesn't help them at all. If they have a sheet over them, at least what they're irradiating is the sheet. The sheet warms up, and it helps give back a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. Same thing. Convection. If they're covered, then there's no chance for the air currents. Right? So no convection. Or whether they heat the air just underneath the sheet, and then that stays there for the most part, so it gives back a little. Kind of like when they give up their seat, you say, thank you for warming it, because, once again, that's conduction. So anyways, sorry, conduction doesn't matter much, but evaporation, same thing. If you can cover that up, or whatever, that's helpful. But this is a biggie. Radiation is the biggest one of heat loss. So what are ways we can prevent radiation? Cover them, but even better, cover them with something metallic. Because if it hits metal, it goes right back. You don't lose anything. This is really convenient. I mean, if you're trying to do an abdominal surgery, I recommend you use these blankets. I'm being sarcastic. This is actually it's a hypothermia prevention management kit, military issue. So it's got a reflective skull cap, self-heating 4-shell liner, and that reflective shell. It's great. It's not that expensive, but when it comes to surgery, it's very useless. Unless you're doing, facial surgery. So, yeah.
So how come they don't make the bear huggers with the top part of it to be
Metallic?
metallic?
Well, as opposed to the plastic sheet you're talking about? I mean, you could do that. It will help a little bit with the radiation. Of course, now you can't see your patient.
Well, you have to lift that thing. It's covered with the drape anyways half the time, so.
But would you rather every time you want to look at the patient's face, lift it up and now expose that face to the ambient air, or have a plastic sheet covering them where you can see them and never move it? So it's a plus and minus thing. Bottom line is, very few things are perfect in what we do, but there are such things out there like metallic, but generally metallic doesn't work very well for us, for our needs.
Metallic salt caps.
Yeah,
That work at
that would
hospitals.
work.
That work.
Sure. I don't know how that's okay.
They use Memorial.
Do they?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
In the OR?
Yeah, all the patients
For all
have
patients, yeah.
skull caps.
So find some evidence.
Mm.
That's when you try. evidence. Now, here's a key thing. You can't just say, well, they use it at Memorial. You need evidence that shows it really is helpful, okay? And if you have solid evidence that it does, implement it somewhere else. Now, there's a cost involved in that project, but it's probably not that high. And if you get ownership by somebody at the other site, hey, I'd love to see us have that at UF Health. Well, then maybe we can do that. That's the easy way.
You need a partner?
Yeah. All right. All right. So, in general anesthesia, set point. Oh, I want to spend slightly a lot more time talking about this. Cover your patients. Try to prevent radiation and convection. Evaporation. Actually, I have some slides talking about preventing that or reducing that. So, during general anesthesia, the set point drops. So that 0.2 degrees Celsius range for autonomic response and other kinds of responses can get as much as 4 degrees Celsius. Meaning a patient can drop like 3 degrees Celsius this way or go at 1 degree Celsius up before the body will finally say, hey, I need to do something about this. And especially on the hypothermic side. Other people at high risk, infants and geriatrics, so there's physiologic alterations, 25% decrease in heat production, autonomic changes. This is a really cool graph that shows a dose-dependent effect on that threshold for 4 different drugs. So let's look, here's desflurane, here's our example of a volatile inhaled anesthetic. And you can see as you go from 0 to 1 MAC, that difference for the 3 thresholds, 3 different actions for that threshold. This is sweating, so this would be something for too high, hyperthermia, and then orange, this orange is vasoconstriction, and then shivering. And you can see there's a couple things to really notice here. One is all of them have some dose-dependent effect on the ability, especially to vasoconstrict and shiver. Okay, the higher the dose, the more impaired, or the colder, that's the better way to say it, the colder you have to be for the body to kick in with those actions. So you can actually get someone to shiver at 32 degrees Celsius under a MAC of anesthesia. That's really bad when they get to 32. There's a lot of problems at 32. Okay, okay, so this is dexmedetomidine, not nearly as much effect. Propofol, alfentanil. So opioids are not nearly as bad as volatile agents. Propofol is actually not that good either. All right. Here's the other thing to notice. Look at the heat removing or the warmth reducing effect. Sweating. You notice that no matter how much of the drug you give, there's very little effect on that response to sweat, which tells us that the brain's response, the blunting of that brain's response is much more there for the presence of hypothermia than it is for hyperthermia. And you will see your patients, you'll be monitoring your patient, they start out 35 degrees, 35.5 degrees, whatever, and it's an 8-hour case. And you turn that barometer on, and it rises, and you forget to pay attention. Now they're 37 degrees, 37.1, 37.2. You finally turn the barometer off, they actually keep getting warmer. This is one of the things that happens. And they're 37.3 degrees, and they are sweating. So they respond much more normally to warmth-reducing effects than they do to warmth-saving effects. Autonomic changes lead to rapid loss in temperature. The greatest decrease in core temperature occurs during the first hour. And that's mostly because of redistribution of heat from the core to the periphery. Okay? Think of it like thick, all right? Pressure, gradients. When the temperature of the periphery is almost the same as the core, and all of a sudden the periphery drops a lot, there's a big gradient. So you're going to have lots of redistribution very quickly. It's happening fast. But then the core starts getting cooler and cooler and cooler. And as that gets cooler, then your gradient is not nearly as much. So you're going to get a lot less redistribution. So an hour into the case, an hour into the anesthesia, that gradient is much less, so you don't lose as much heat as fast, but you've already lost a ton. See that? The other reason why that occurs the most during the first hour is because as you get colder, the body finally starts being able to respond even under anesthesia and start doing something about it. Eventually, you're going to get like 34 degrees, and all those things kick in. Most of them, at least. All right. This is a graph that shows core body temperature. So it's typical pattern of hypothermia during anesthesia. It shows starting at normal. Here's 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees Celsius, 0, 1, 2 hours. So this is the point of anesthesia right here. At 1 hour, we're already at over a degree drop. At 2 hours, we're at like another half, and then less of a difference with each time. And eventually it kind of plateaus out. Your patient will plateau out at about 34 degrees typically. If you do nothing to help them. If you do nothing at all, like they're naked for 6 hours, they'll plateau out below 34 if the room is cold. But if you've got them covered up and that kind of thing, like a perfect example of that for me is I'm doing a case in interventional radiology. I didn't get a chance to get a barometer, it was an emergency, and here we are, we're kind of stuck. Everything's covered. I just can't really get in there and do much except maybe cover their head a little bit or whatever. And I've had that happen, and they plateau out about 34.2, 34.5. I try to keep the room a little warmer, but they don't have the ability to change it there in the IR suite like they do in our rooms. So, but I've seen it very much plateau out. Okay, effects of hypothermia. This is some interesting stuff here. So in mild hypothermia, you'll have an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and cardiac output. That makes sense. You can vasoconstrict and all that. Of course, this is all not assuming anesthesia, just normal reaction. But it's similar to anesthesia, just not as much. When you get more hypothermic, like below 33 degrees, you start to get the opposite effect. This is when it's getting bad. You get below 31 degrees, you get some atrial ventricular irritability, bradycardia, profound VFib is likely at less than 30, and at 19 to 20 degrees, you have a systole, typically. The coolest thing, but the best way to see that is when they throw ice on a heart for cardiopulmonary bypass. When they throw the ice water on there, I mean, you just see EKG just, I know they're using cardioplegia at the same time too, but like just that, throwing that ice water on the heart, you just see an immediate change in EKG. So renal function. Renal function is dependent on cardiac output. So at mild hypothermia, if you have an increase in cardiac output, you're going to have an increase in urine production. So you actually get polyuria. We all know about that. It's cold outside. Gosh, I'm like faggot recent like crazy. It happened. This happened to all of us. We know what we're talking about. What's really odd, though, is at more profound hypothermia, the afferent pressure increases secondary to systemic vasoconstriction. At more profound, at less than 33 degrees, the glomerular filtration rate decreases, and there's an impairment of distal tubular reabsorption, and you get more polyuria. So unlike the cardiovascular effects where they flip, in renal, they just continue to just make urine. All right. Other effects, well, your hematocrit will rise as you get rid of water. Platelets are sequestered in the spleen. You'll have coagulopathy. There's also an effect on like the actual clotting factors. So we have cardiovascular consequences. Delivery of oxygen is what happens in hypothermia as far as delivery of oxygen. So it's decreased. Why?
Shift to the left.
What?
Shift to the left.
Shift.
Yes, a shift to the left of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Very good, right? When in hypothermia, you have a shift to the left, which means for the same saturation, you're going to have a lower PaO2, right? And therefore, lower concentration gradient of oxygen transfers to tissue. Coagulation, wound infection is a big deal. There's all sorts of studies that show wound infection is increased in hypothermia, which is one of the big reasons why we get a lot of buy-in by the surgeons for preventing hypothermia, because they don't want wound infections. They'll certainly blame us. Drug metabolism is another one, and PACU-STEN. There's all sorts of studies here that looked at different things. You can see, like in this case, this Kurtz et al. Surgical wound infection. This is a big study. Even though it's 200, it was like one of the big ones out there. With a 2-degree drop in core temperature, they had 19% what was wound infection, 19%, so a threefold increase in wound infection. Duration of hospital stay, slightly longer. Look at this intraoperative blood loss. There's another really good one here. I bet this is very interesting. One of the things we learn about cis-atracurium is it's eliminated by what? Osmotic elimination, which means what factors affect its elimination? pH temperature. So hypothermia will actually increase the duration, decrease the metabolism. Look at this about vecuronium. Atracurium would be that case, right? Vecuronium, it was a small sample size, but look at the difference in normothermic versus hypothermic of a 2-degree difference as far as duration goes. Huh, that's a pretty significant difference. To the point where even though I had a sample size of 20, the p-value is very, very profound. I will tell you that I have seen this in practice, that even though we don't really learn that rocuronium and vecuronium are extended or last longer than present hypothermia, I've seen it. And I've definitely seen the opposite. People in a hypermetabolic state, they just, rocuronium is like nothing to them. They just chew right through it. You know, so odd, but I've seen it incredibly so. This is more an expansion on some of those studies. So this is from the 31st Combat Surgical Hospital in Baghdad back in the mid-2000s. This combat surgical hospital, wonderful. They, I mean, I almost get chill bumps when I think about it because, you know, we're talking about like the middle of Desert Storm and that kind of thing. And not only were they doing lots of things for our injured soldiers, they were documenting and gathering data. And they have, it's not just that one surgical hospital, but they did a lot of the most documentation. The military has revolutionized the way we treat trauma. Some of the concepts were just really getting some traction about how we resuscitate people, crystalloids versus colloids and that kind of thing. Some of that was just getting traction, but hard to accept in the normal journals. They did it there and they documented it, and because of their tremendous results, it was like a huge change in the way we now act. But this is one of the pieces of data they got when they looked at emission or arrival at temperature. They had 79 people show up at less than 95 degrees Fahrenheit. 1878 show up greater than 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And look at the mortality percent on this side versus that side. Now we all know there had been a lot of other factors that contributed to this mortality than just hypothermia, but it is a very interesting graph to look at that difference. So what we call this level 1 evidence? No. It's not an RCT. It's not even close. It's just some observational data. This would be like level bottom, but it's still interesting. So this was from an old journal that when they had patients admitted at less than 32 degrees, they had 100% mortality. So prevention studies: cover skin surface, forced air warmers, bear huggers, or the rave. Fluid warmers. Now they're flow dependent. If the faster your flow, the more they're helpful. But the faster your flow, the more you need them. So like a KVO versus rapid bolus. If you're giving a KVO, fluid warmers are worthless, as is using warm fluid to begin with. Even more of that. Gas humidification and warming. The big thing in the last 5 to 8 years has been pre-warming. So at like UF Health, they have those paper gowns that have the built-in bear huggers. And there was a big initiative, probably somebody's DMP project, I don't know, where a couple of years ago we pre-warmed everybody. And now, like, nobody uses them. It's kind of silly. But we have those bear huggers designed for them so that when they're in pre-op holding, they can hook it up and they can get pre-warmed. Well, interesting enough, if this study was done where they pre-warmed the patient and then everything else was left the same. And so, yeah, prior to induction, their temperatures were higher. But then after induction, they stayed even more higher. That proper English? I guess so, kind of. Yeah, I guess it is right. Even more higher. See how this gap got even bigger? So this is also another thing that's come out is the biggest blowback you'll get to using a bear hugger are orthopods doing total joint surgery. They are not fond of bear huggers. And this is partially because a study came out a couple years ago saying that, a single microbe can cause a wound infection, a major infection. Maybe, maybe not, but that's what they believe. And for total joints, because they, when that, and it is true, when those implants get infected, or get microbes on them, they're much more prone to cause a major infection than just a skin something. Or even an intra-abdominal microbe. It's not that big a deal in comparison to the hardware. The hardware is just bad. So, there's a study came out showing that the use of forced air warmers, that they had an increase in surgical infections, which is interesting because in general, using forced air warmers helps prevent surgical infections. So it's a big battle. And the companies that make the money are so involved in this. They are so it is gross. Go and look up 3M, that company 3M, they're the ones who make the air huggers, and they have propaganda on the website. And then there's this other reflective blanket that the orthopods are pushing, and the company that makes it, it's it reminds me of a lot of the Facebook stuff where they're talking about natural versus medicine and that kind of thing, and they're constantly attacking each other with half-truths. It's just crazy. It's all about money. It's really what it's all about. But there's some flaws to the study. I can't tell you exactly what they were, but there is a concern. There is at least a concern. So the best thing to do, if you have an orthopod who really bucks you about using a bear hugger, is have them pre-warmed. Because if they do a joint in an hour and a half and they're pre-warmed properly, the literature does say that they're going to be fine. Their temperature will never get that hypothermic. So, but if they're not pre-warmed, they sit in a cold pre-op holding, and then you don't use a bear hugger, and there's just this other kind of blanket that they have. I haven't even seen a picture of it. Yeah, I just was reading about this yesterday. That's it. I did see a picture of it.
Yeah.
So
Dr. Augustine, who created the bear hugger, sold it to 3M, and then came up with a new one. I was trying to remember the name of it, so I was reading it too. The hot dog.
The hot dog.
And
but it has a technical name. It's
no,
called,
that's what
Is
it's
it
called.
No,
phase?
what?
Well,
Is it liquid phase?
it's a
But there's
it's a
another
fluid-based
name.
blanket.
It's an acronym. Non-ambient or non.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like the ability to heat, but without air movement. I forget
Well,
what
now
it is.
he's saying that the bear huggers pose a threat because he no longer has.
That's right. Isn't that
financial
crazy?
state.
So-
Right.
So here's the thing. So there's a study that has been done recently where they say that those patients do just fine with this other product when they're pre-warmed. So they haven't done a study where they pre-warm nothing versus pre-warm this device. They've just done pre-warm this device versus straight up bear hugger, no pre-warm. And, okay, well, so bottom line is if the surgeon really hates it and believes that you're at fault if there's infection, there are other ways to approach it. Pre-warm them, and you can even use this device. Fine. There are studies that show that that works. So, anyway. That's kind of a new thing, device. I need to get in my lecture. So, all right. There's just some more stuff here. Yeah. Okay, fresh gas flow. So I mentioned earlier about moisture and also about heat. Fresh gas flow is a key thing. High fresh gas flows means you're putting lots of cold, non-humidified air into the circuit and very little rebreathed air. So this is what I would challenge you to do. I want you to look at the absorber when you're in the OR. Look for moisture. All right? If you don't see any moisture, you're probably running higher flows. If you're running, let's say, a half a liter flow, which good luck getting somebody other than like a few of us to let you do that, you'll see tons of moisture in there. The reason why is you're conserving the moisture. But the other thing is, it's a big factor for heat. Those absorbers do produce a lot of heat already, first of all. And so if you're rebreathing all that warm air. If you're instead doing very little rebreathing, you're just introducing lots of cold air, cold, dry air, and that is a great way to dry out and make your patient cold. So, so if you can get those flow rates less than a liter, you're doing a lot to help conserve heat. Heat giving IV fluids. So the big thing about this is, so I had a student, an MSN student, do a study on this. She took temperature probes and she put it in warm fluids and then put a temperature probe at the end of tubing. And she ran different flow rates. And what she basically found was if you ran at 1 liter an hour, there was certainly a big difference between the theoretical going into the patient temperature and ambient. A big difference. It was like, I think it dropped from 41 degrees to maybe somewhere around 32, something like that, at 1 liter flow, 1 liter per hour. Once you got below 500 cc's an hour, there was almost no difference between ambient and the temperature at the end of the tubing. Definitely by the time you reached 100 cc's an hour, there was no difference. So if it was 20 degrees in the room, it was 20 degrees at the end of that tubing at the slow rate, yeah.
That's why they have the hotline, right?
Exactly. So if you want to help prevent that, you use a hotline, or now we have like these new warming devices that you have help, where the heat source is closer to the patient. Now, if you can use cold or warm fluids, but it's going to heat it up, and now it's going to go a lot less distance before it reaches that patient, and then to be exposed to ambient from the heat source. Hotlines are great because you can usually put an stopcock right after and then one extension. These other ones that we have now, I don't like them because you have this device and you end up putting 2 or 3 extensions on them afterwards. It's the same principle. What's that? Yeah, the little metal one. Yeah, I don't
The ones that go in the end of the bear hugger hose. It's like
there are other things like that. You can jury rig stuff like that too. But the bottom line is, just remember, if you're warming your fluids but then doing nothing to keep the fluids warm along the tubing, there's very little effect to that, except at a bolus level. Certainly, if I'm going to sit there and open up fluids, I don't want to open up cold fluids without, assuming no hotline. But if I don't have a hotline and I know I'm going to get some volume, I will even take the cold fluids off and put a warm one on there. If that's the case, suddenly I feel like I need to lose a lot of volume. But hotlines, the level ones and the Belmonts and all that stuff, heat it closer to the source. So what else do we do? We cover everything. Cover the head. Even a blanket over the head is way better than nothing. Limit skin exposure. Increase ambient room temperature. Warm the fluids and irrigants. And that they do that with the irrigants. They have warmers for their irrigants. They should not be dumping ambient fluids into the abdomen. That would be bad, and they don't do that. So, but the easiest way to prevent heat loss is to stop radiation. The only way you add energy to the system is actually a heat source, like a bear hugger, heat lamps, stuff like that. And why are we so worried about hypothermia? There's one other really good reason. Although we have to wait like another year and a half till we have to worry about it. With that